Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through time. Take a moment now to settle into your pillows, to adjust your blankets around you, to let the tensions of the day slowly dissolve into the quiet space around you. Breathe deeply, slowly, and let your mind drift backward through the years, back through decades of history, back to the spring of 1937, back to an evening in early May when the sky held a giant, when the air carried expectation, and when the world was about to witness something that would change aviation forever. The date is May 6th, 1937. The place is Lakehurst Naval Air Station in New Jersey. The time is approaching 7:30 in the evening. A light rain has been falling throughout the day, and now the clouds hang low and heavy over the flat expanse of the landing field. In the distance, moving slowly through the grey twilight, comes a shape so enormous, so improbable, that it seems to defy the very laws of nature. 804 feet long, longer than 3 city blocks placed end to end, the German airship Hindenburg approaches its mooring mast, completing what would be its final flight across the Atlantic Ocean. But before we reach that moment, before we stand on that field and watch the impossible unfold, let us travel further back. Let us understand what brought us to this point. Let us feel the wonder that people felt when they first saw these giants of the sky, these floating palaces, these vessels that promised to shrink the world and bring continents together in ways that had never been possible before. Close your eyes now and imagine a time when the very idea of human flight was still touched with magic, when airplanes were small and fragile things, when the ocean crossing by ship took 5 days or more, and when the future seemed to belong not to winged aircraft, but to these enormous, stately, graceful ships of the air. Let the story begin. The birth of the airship age. In the late 1800s, when Queen Victoria still sat upon the throne of England and the American Civil War was a recent memory, a German cavalry officer named Ferdinand von Zeppelin began to dream. Count Zeppelin, as he would come to be known, had served in the Franco-Prussian War and had witnessed the use of observation balloons during military campaigns. These simple gas bags, tethered to the ground, could lift observers high enough to see enemy positions and movements. But Zeppelin imagined something far grander. What if a balloon could be made rigid, shaped, controllable? What if it could be powered by engines and steered like a ship through the ocean of air? The idea consumed him. After retiring from military service in 1891, Zeppelin devoted his life and his considerable fortune to making his dream a reality. The technical challenges were immense. How do you create a structure light enough to float, yet strong enough to withstand the forces of wind and weather? How do you power such a craft? How do you control its direction and altitude? Zeppelin worked methodically, designing a framework of aluminum rings and girders, creating a cigar-shaped hull covered in fabric, and dividing the interior into separate cells filled with hydrogen gas, the lightest element known to science. On July 2nd, 1900, on Lake Constance, near Friedrichshafen in southern Germany, the first Zeppelin airship rose into the sky. It flew for only 20 minutes and covered just 3.5 miles before technical problems forced it down. But it flew. It was controllable. It was steerable. Count von Zeppelin had proven that rigid airships were possible. Over the next decade, he refined his designs, built new and larger ships, and slowly convinced a skeptical public and government that airships represented the future of transportation. The early years were difficult. Crashes and accidents plagued the development program. Funding was always uncertain, but Zeppelin persevered, driven by his vision of a world connected by air travel. By 1910, the German people had embraced the Zeppelin as a source of national pride. The Count had become a hero, his name synonymous with technological progress and German ingenuity. The Deutsche Luftschifffahrts Aktiengesellschaft, known as DELAG, became the world's first airline, offering passenger flights on Zeppelin airships between German cities. Then came the Great War. World War I transformed Zeppelins from passenger vessels into weapons. The German military saw their potential for reconnaissance and bombing raids. During the war, Zeppelin airships conducted numerous raids on England, dropping bombs on London and other cities. bringing the terror of air warfare to civilian populations for the first time in history. The sight of a Zeppelin floating overhead in the darkness, engines droning, bombs falling, created a new kind of fear. But the airships proved vulnerable to fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft fire. Many were shot down in flames, their hydrogen gas bags turning them into infernos in the sky. The war exposed both the potential and the terrible dangers of these hydrogen-filled giants. After the war ended in 1918, the Treaty of Versailles forbade Germany from building military airships. But Count von Zeppelin, who died in 1917 before seeing the war's end, had always believed in the peaceful potential of his creations. His successors at the Zeppelin Company turned their attention back to civilian transportation. In the 1920s, they built new ships specifically designed for passenger service across the Atlantic Ocean, connecting Europe and the Americas in ways that had never been possible before. The 1920s and early 1930s became the golden age of airship travel. While airplanes were still small, unreliable, and incapable of crossing oceans, Zeppelins offered luxury, comfort, and speed. A voyage across the Atlantic by ship took 5 days in good weather, often longer. A Zeppelin could make the crossing in 2.5 days, flying smoothly above the weather, carrying passengers in accommodations that rivaled the finest ocean liners. The Graf Zeppelin, launched in 1928, flew more than 1 million miles and carried thousands of passengers on routes spanning the globe. It circled the Earth in just 21 days. It flew to the Arctic. It completed successful commercial service between Germany and South America. The future, it seemed, belonged to the airship. But the golden age was brief. By the mid-1930s, airplanes were growing larger, faster, and more reliable. The Boeing 247, introduced in 1933, could carry 10 passengers across the United States. The Douglas DC-3, introduced in 1935, could fly coast to coast with only 3 stops. These aircraft were economical, relatively safe, and pointed toward a future very different from the one the Zeppelin pioneers had imagined. Still, for transatlantic travel, the airship remained supreme. No airplane could yet cross the ocean carrying passengers in comfort and safety. The newest and largest Zeppelin, named the Hindenburg, represented the culmination of decades of experience and technological refinement. It was designed to prove that airship travel was not only possible, but superior to any alternative. It was built to be the flagship of a new fleet that would dominate intercontinental travel for decades to come. It would have only 1 season of service. The Hindenburg's construction. In the early 1930s, the Luftschiffbau Zeppelin Company began designing what would be the largest aircraft ever built. The new airship, designated LZ-129, was commissioned by the Deutsche Zeppelin Reederei, the German Zeppelin airline company. It was intended to provide fast, luxurious passenger service across the Atlantic, carrying wealthy travelers between Europe and America in unprecedented comfort and speed. The man overseeing the design was Dr. Hugo Eckener, who had become the director of the Zeppelin Company after Count von Zeppelin's death. Eckener was a pragmatist and a brilliant navigator who had piloted the Graf Zeppelin on its greatest voyages. He understood both the technical challenges and the commercial potential of airship travel. The design that emerged was breathtaking in its ambition. The new airship would be 804 feet long, more than twice the length of a Boeing 747 jumbo jet. Its maximum diameter would be 135 feet. It would have a gas capacity of 7 million cubic feet, filled with hydrogen, divided among 16 separate gas cells. The framework would consist of a lattice of duralumin, an aluminum alloy that provided strength without excessive weight. Rings and longitudinal girders would create the rigid structure, giving the ship its characteristic cigar shape. The outer covering would be cotton fabric, stretched tight over the frame and treated with a coating to protect it from weather and to reduce weight. The construction took place in a massive hangar at Friedrichshafen on Lake Constance. The hangar itself was one of the largest buildings in the world, needed to accommodate the enormous dimensions of modern Zeppelins. Workers assembled the framework section by section, carefully joining the rings and girders, checking measurements, ensuring that every joint was sound and every wire was properly tensioned. The work was meticulous, almost artistic. The airship took shape slowly, a skeleton of metal growing in the cavernous space of the hangar. As the framework neared completion, workers began installing the gas cells, enormous balloons of goldbeater's skin, a material made from the intestines of cattle, chosen for its lightness and its ability to contain hydrogen gas. The engines were mounted in 4 gondolas, engine cars that hung below the hull on struts. Each gondola contained a Daimler-Benz diesel engine, producing just over 1,000 horsepower. These engines, burning diesel fuel rather than gasoline, were chosen partly for their efficiency and partly because diesel fuel was less flammable, a safety consideration in a hydrogen-filled ship. The engines drove propellers that could push the airship through the air at speeds up to 84 miles per hour, faster than most ships and competitive with contemporary aircraft. But it was the passenger accommodations that truly set the Hindenburg apart. While the Graf Zeppelin had carried 20 passengers in relatively Spartan conditions, the Hindenburg was designed to carry 50 passengers in luxury. The passenger decks were located inside the hull, protected from the wind and cold, accessible by staircases from the gondola below. On the main deck, called A deck, were the public rooms. A dining room could seat all 50 passengers at once, with tables set with fine china and crystal, served by white-coated stewards. The walls were decorated with paintings depicting scenes from the history of airship travel and exploration. A lounge area offered comfortable chairs, a baby grand piano made of aluminum to save weight, and large slanted windows that looked down on the earth passing slowly below. Adjacent to the lounge was the writing room, panelled in light-coloured wood, with desks and stationery for passengers who wished to write letters during the voyage. And perhaps most remarkable of all, there was a smoking room. Yes, a smoking room on a hydrogen-filled airship. This may seem like madness, but the Zeppelin engineers were confident in their safety measures. The smoking room was sealed and pressurized, with its own airlock entrance. Only one lighter was permitted inside, an electric lighter permanently mounted to a table and controlled by the room's steward. The walls were insulated with asbestos. No passenger could enter with matches or their own lighter. It was, theoretically, perfectly safe. Below A deck was B deck, where the passenger cabins were located. There were 25 cabins in total, most designed for 2 passengers, though some could accommodate a single traveller, or, with a connecting door opened, serve a family group. The cabins were small but efficiently designed, similar to sleeping compartments on a luxury train. Each had 2 berths, one folding down from the wall, a small washstand with running water, a porthole window, and storage space for luggage. The furnishings were simple but elegant, designed to be lightweight while still providing comfort. Between the cabins on each side of the corridor were shared washrooms with toilets and showers, modern conveniences that were remarkable for an aircraft of any kind in the 1930s. The crew accommodations were more austere, located toward the rear of the ship. But even here, the designers had paid attention to comfort and efficiency. The Hindenburg required a crew of between 40 and 61, depending on the voyage. This included the flight crew, navigators, radio operators, engineers who tended the engines and monitored the gas cells, riggers who handled the ropes and cables during landing and takeoff, stewards who served the passengers, and cooks who prepared meals in the small but well-equipped kitchen. The original design called for the Hindenburg to be filled with helium, an inert gas that would not burn. Helium was safer than hydrogen in every way. It would make the airship nearly fireproof. But there was a problem. Helium was rare, difficult to extract, and expensive. Nearly all of the world's helium came from natural gas wells in the United States, and the American government, concerned about military applications of airships, had passed laws restricting helium exports. Germany applied for permission to purchase helium for the Hindenburg, but the request was denied. The Zeppelin company had no choice. The Hindenburg would fly with hydrogen, the same lifting gas that had been used in all previous Zeppelins, the same gas that had caused so many airship disasters in the past. The designers incorporated every safety measure they could devise. The gas cells were separated from the passenger areas. Smoking was strictly controlled. Open flames were prohibited, except in carefully controlled spaces. Static electricity, which could create sparks, was dissipated through grounding wires. But hydrogen remained, filling the cells above the passengers' heads, 7 million cubic feet of the most flammable gas known to humanity. The Hindenburg was launched on March 4, 1936. The christening ceremony was a grand affair, attended by high-ranking Nazi officials, for by this time Germany was under the control of Adolf Hitler's regime. The Nazi government saw propaganda value in the Hindenburg. It was the largest aircraft in the world, a symbol of German technological prowess and industrial might. The ship's vertical tail fins were painted with swastikas, the symbol of the Nazi Party. This political association would later trouble Dr. Eckener, who despised the Nazis but had no power to prevent them from using his creation for their purposes. The early test flights went well. The Hindenburg handled beautifully, responding smoothly to the controls, maintaining altitude easily, flying with a grace that belied its enormous size. In March of 1936, the ship made its first long-distance flight, carrying passengers from Germany to South America and back. Over the next year, the Hindenburg would complete 63 flights, including 10 successful round trips across the Atlantic Ocean to Lakehurst, New Jersey, carrying hundreds of passengers safely and comfortably. It was everything its designers had hoped for: fast, reliable, luxurious, and seemingly safe. Passengers marveled at the experience. You could stand at the windows and watch the ocean pass beneath you at less than 1,000 feet of altitude, so low that you could see whales and ships in detail. The ride was smooth, far more comfortable than any airplane of the era. There was space to walk around, socially interact, enjoy fine meals, sleep in real beds. It was travel as it had never been before. By the spring of 1937, the Hindenburg had established itself as the most successful passenger aircraft in the world. Its safety record was perfect. Not a single passenger had been harmed in over a year of operations. The Zeppelin Company was planning to build additional ships. The American and British were developing their own large airships to compete. The future of intercontinental air travel seemed to belong to these giants of the sky. And then came May 6, 1937. Life aboard the Hindenburg. To understand what was lost when the Hindenburg burned, you must understand what it was like to fly aboard her. Imagine you are a passenger in the spring of 1937. You have purchased your ticket months in advance. The fare is $400 one way, equivalent to about $7,000 today. Expensive but not impossible for the wealthy travelers who could afford transatlantic travel. You arrive at the Rhine-Main airport near Frankfurt, Germany, where the Hindenburg is moored. Even from a distance, the sight of the ship takes your breath away. It is almost incomprehensible in size, dwarfing the hangars and buildings around it, floating gently at the top of its mooring mast, like some impossible dream made real. Boarding takes place from the passenger terminal. You and your fellow passengers, perhaps 30 or 40 people for this particular voyage, gather in the departure lounge. The atmosphere is one of excitement, mixed with a touch of nervousness. Many passengers are first-time flyers on an airship. The stewards check your luggage, weighing each piece carefully. For weight is critical on an airship. You are allowed one suitcase, not to exceed 60 pounds. Cameras, binoculars, and small bags can be carried aboard, but no matches, no lighters, no flammable materials of any kind. These restrictions are explained politely but firmly. Safety is paramount. When boarding is called, you walk across the field to the mooring mast. A passenger gondola is lowered from the ship, and you climb a stairway into this capsule. The gondola then rises, lifting you up into the belly of the giant ship above. You step from the gondola into the lower passenger deck, and immediately you are struck by how normal everything seems. This is not the cramped, cold interior of a primitive aircraft. This is a ship, with corridors and cabins, with carpeting and painted walls, with electric lights and the hum of activity. Stewards in crisp white uniforms greet you and show you to your cabin. Your cabin is small but comfortable. 2 beds, a washstand, a small closet. Everything is designed with efficiency in mind, but there is attention to detail and beauty. The porthole window is framed in polished metal. The walls are panelled in pale wood. You place your suitcase in the storage space and return to the corridor to explore before departure. Other passengers are doing the same, their voices filled with wonder and curiosity. Children press their faces to windows. Adults exchange greetings, asking where each other is travelling to and from, what brings them on this journey. There is a sense of community forming already, the bond of shared adventure. A gong sounds, and a steward's voice echoes through the corridor. All visitors must go ashore. The Hindenburg is preparing for departure. You make your way up the stairs to A deck, to the lounge and dining room, where most passengers gather for takeoff. Through the large, slanted windows, you can see the ground crew below, 100 men holding ropes, keeping the ship steady. The engines start, a distant thrumming that you feel more than hear. Commands are shouted. The mooring clamp is released. The ground crew lets go of the ropes, and the Hindenburg rises. The sensation is unlike anything you have experienced. There is no roar of engines, no buffeting wind, no stomach-dropping acceleration. The airship simply lifts, as gently as a soap bubble rising from a child's wand. The ground falls away below you. The airport buildings shrink. The city of Frankfurt spreads out like a map. You are flying, but it feels more like floating. The lounge is filled with quiet exclamations of amazement. A few passengers clap. Someone laughs with delight. You move to the windows and look down at Germany passing beneath you. And you realize that this is how gods must see the world. For the next 2.5 days, the Hindenburg will be your world. You settle into the rhythm of airship life. Meals are served at regular times in the dining room, and they are elaborate affairs. The kitchen, though small, produces food that would be admirable in any fine restaurant. Fresh bread, roasted meats, vegetables, soups, desserts, wine and beer are served with dinner. Coffee and tea are always available. The head steward takes pride in the service, ensuring that every passenger is satisfied. Between meals, you are free to do as you please. Many passengers spend hours at the windows, watching the world pass below. The airship flies low enough that you can make out roads, farmhouses, forests, and rivers in remarkable detail. When crossing the ocean, you might see ships ploughing through the waves beneath you, and you feel a sense of superiority, knowing that you are traveling faster and more comfortably than those poor souls battling the Atlantic swells. The lounge becomes the social center of the ship. Passengers gather to talk, to play cards, to read books from the small library. The piano is played by anyone with skill and inclination. In the evening, someone might lead a sing-along, voices rising in German folk songs or American jazz numbers. Friendships form quickly in this confined space. Couples who met only at boarding might be dining together by the second day. Children find playmates and race through the corridors until a steward gently reminds them to walk. The atmosphere is one of relaxed civility, similar to the experience on a luxury ocean liner. At night, you return to your cabin, change into nightclothes, and slip into your berth. The linens are crisp and clean, changed daily by the attentive stewards. The pillow is soft, filled with down, remarkably comfortable for an aircraft. The engines hum in the distance, a sound that quickly becomes comforting, a mechanical lullaby that speaks of power and reliability. The ship rocks ever so gently, a motion so slight you might not notice it consciously, but which lulls you like a cradle, like being rocked in your mother's arms when you were a child. Through your porthole, if the sky is clear, you can see stars, brilliant and sharp, closer than you have ever seen them from the ground, undimmed by city lights or atmospheric haze. The moon, if it is out, casts silver light across the waves below, creating a path that seems to lead to infinity. You drift off to sleep, and when you wake in the morning, you might be over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, hours from any land, suspended between sea and sky in this miraculous vessel. The morning brings its own routines. You wash at the small basin in your cabin, the water cold but refreshing. You dress in fresh clothes from your carefully packed suitcase. A steward knocks gently and informs you that breakfast is being served in the dining room. You make your way up the stairs, greeting other passengers emerging from their cabins, all of you sharing the bond of this extraordinary experience. In the dining room, the tables are set with white linens, silver cutlery, china cups, and plates. The morning meal might include fresh bread and butter, jam, cold cuts, cheese, boiled eggs, fruit, and coffee or tea. You sit at your assigned table, and conversation flows easily. Where are you traveling to? What is your business in America? Have you flown on an airship before? The atmosphere is convivial, relaxed, the beginning of friendships that might last long after the voyage ends. If the weather is good, the flight crew sometimes allows passengers to visit the control gondola at the front of the ship, where the officers navigate and fly the airship. You climb downstairs into this separate space and find yourself in what feels like the bridge of a great ship. There are large windows offering a panoramic view forward. The captain and watch officers stand at their stations. The navigator works at his charts. The elevator man controls the vertical angle of the ship by adjusting the angle of the horizontal tail surfaces. The rudder man steers left and right with the vertical rudder. It is all surprisingly simple and elegant. There are no complex instruments, no panels full of gauges and switches. Navigation is done by dead reckoning, by compass headings and careful observation of the wind and sea below. Radio messages are exchanged with the ground, weather reports received and discussed. You stand there for a few minutes, watching these men work, and you understand that flying this ship is as much art as science, requiring skill, experience, and judgment. As the voyage continues, you become accustomed to the sensation of flight. It no longer seems remarkable to look out and see clouds at eye level, or to watch a storm system miles away, knowing that the airship will simply fly around it. Time takes on a different quality. There is no hurry, no schedule beyond meal times and the eventual arrival. The world has slowed down. You read, you talk, you watch the sea, you nap. It is profoundly relaxing. Many passengers report that they sleep better on the Hindenburg than they do at home. The gentle motion, the steady hum of the engines, the isolation from all worldly concerns, creates a sense of peace that is hard to find anywhere else. And then, on the afternoon of the second or third day, depending on winds, someone spots land ahead, the coast of America, or the coast of Europe if you are traveling eastward. Word spreads quickly through the ship. Passengers crowd to the windows. There, rising from the sea, is the promised land. If approaching America, you might pass over Cape Cod, then Long Island, then the city of New York itself. The Hindenburg flies low over Manhattan, and passengers gasp at the sight of the skyscrapers rising beneath them, the streets laid out in their famous grid, the Hudson River gleaming in the sun. The ship circles the city, showing off, and people on the ground look up and point and wave. It is a moment of shared wonder, this meeting of earth and sky. From New York, it is a short flight south to Lakehurst, New Jersey, where the landing field and mooring mast await. The Hindenburg circles the field, while the ground crew prepares. The landing process is the most delicate part of the voyage. The ship must be slowed, brought down to a precise altitude, positioned exactly over the mooring mast. Ropes are dropped from the nose and from various points along the hull. The ground crew seizes these ropes and pulls the ship down slowly, fighting any wind that might push it off course. Passengers watch from the windows, excited to be arriving, but perhaps a little sad that the voyage is ending. When the ship finally settles at the mast and the engines shut down, there is a moment of silence, and then someone begins to applaud, and soon everyone is clapping, celebrating the successful completion of another Atlantic crossing. You disembark, climbing down from the passenger gondola to the ground, and as your feet touch solid earth again, you look back up at the Hindenburg, towering above you. What an experience it has been. What a marvel of engineering and human ambition. You tell yourself that you will do this again, that this is the future of travel, that airships like this will carry millions of people across oceans and continents for decades to come. But for 36 people aboard the flight arriving at Lakehurst on the evening of May 6, 1937, there would be no return journey. Previous voyages and reputation. The Hindenburg's first season of operations, in 1936, had been a remarkable success. The airship completed 10 round trips between Germany and the United States, carrying a total of more than 1,000 passengers without a single injury. It had also made several flights to South America, where German immigrants and business interests created strong demand for fast, comfortable travel. Every flight arrived safely, on time, or close to it. The ship established a reputation for reliability that exceeded even the optimistic predictions of its creators. Passengers who flew on the Hindenburg during that first season praised it effusively. Travel writers published glowing accounts in newspapers and magazines. The Hindenburg was described as the most comfortable way to cross the Atlantic, superior even to the great ocean liners like the Queen Mary or the Normandy. While ship passengers spent 5 days or more at sea, often suffering from seasickness as the ship rolled and pitched in heavy weather, Hindenburg passengers made the crossing in less than half that time, flying in smooth comfort above the weather. A businessman could leave Frankfurt on Monday evening and be in New York by Thursday morning, conduct business, and be back in Germany the following week. It was unprecedented. The wealthy and famous were drawn to this new form of travel. American businessmen and financiers flew on the Hindenburg. German diplomats and government officials used it for official travel. There were journalists, scientists, artists, and aristocrats. Some passengers flew simply for the experience, to say they had crossed the ocean by air, to be part of history in the making. The passenger list for any given voyage read like a who's who of international society, and every one of these passengers returned with stories of luxury and wonder, of meals served on fine china, of watching whales in the ocean below, of flying through the night above the clouds, with stars blazing overhead. The ship also carried mail, which was highly valued by stamp collectors. A letter carried across the Atlantic on the Hindenburg received a special postal marking, and these covers, as they were called, became instant collectibles. Philatelists around the world eagerly awaited each flight, hoping to acquire mail from that voyage. The Zeppelin Company recognized this interest and made special arrangements for stamped envelopes to be carried on every flight, creating a small but steady additional revenue stream. But it was not just passengers and mail that the Hindenburg carried. It also served as a symbol, a representation of what human beings could accomplish when they combined ambition, skill, and determination. In Germany, the Hindenburg was a source of national pride. It represented German technological superiority, German craftsmanship, German ingenuity. The Nazi government, which had come to power in 1933, enthusiastically promoted the airship as evidence of the new Germany's strength. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels ensured that images of the Hindenburg appeared frequently in newsreels and publications. The sight of this enormous machine, with swastikas painted on its tail fins, floating majestically over cities and landscapes, was powerful propaganda indeed. In America, the Hindenburg was viewed with a mixture of admiration and unease. Americans marveled at the technological achievement, but there was also concern about Germany's growing military power and aggressive behavior under Hitler's regime. Some newspaper editorials questioned whether the United States should allow German airships to operate freely in American airspace, but these concerns remained in the background. The Hindenburg was a commercial vessel, carrying passengers and mail, and it was treated accordingly. By the spring of 1937, as the ship prepared for its second season of Atlantic crossings, confidence in the airship was at an all-time high. The Zeppelin Company had ordered the construction of a sister ship to be named LZ-130, which would enter service later in the year. Plans were being drawn up for even larger airships, ships that might carry 100 passengers or more. In England, the government was reconsidering its airship program after the catastrophic crash of the R-101 in 1930, which had killed 48 people and ended British airship development. But the Germans had learned from that disaster, and the Hindenburg's perfect safety record seemed to prove that large passenger airships were not only possible but safe. The airship was scheduled to make 18 round trips across the Atlantic during the 1937 season, departing from Frankfurt every 2 weeks. The first flight of the season, on March 20th, had arrived at Lakehurst without incident. The second departure from Germany took place on the evening of May 3rd. Aboard were 36 passengers, far fewer than the ship's capacity of 50. This was unusual. Typically, flights were fully booked months in advance. But there had been some last-minute cancellations, and the economic situation in Europe was uncertain, leading some potential passengers to postpone their travel plans. Still, the flight would proceed as scheduled. May was a pleasant time to cross the Atlantic. The weather was usually favorable. The crew was experienced and confident. Captain Max Pruss, the ship's commander for this voyage, had logged thousands of hours on Zeppelin airships. He knew the Hindenburg intimately, understood its quirks and characteristics, and had successfully completed multiple Atlantic crossings. As the Hindenburg lifted off from Frankfurt that evening, rising gracefully into the sky, turning west toward the ocean, no one aboard had any reason for concern. The weather forecast was good. The ship was in excellent condition. The engines were running smoothly. Everything was routine. The passengers settled into their cabins. The crew went about their duties. And the great airship sailed into the gathering darkness, heading for America and what everyone believed would be just another successful voyage. Within 3 days, the Hindenburg would be gone, destroyed in less than a minute, and the age of the passenger airship would be over forever. The final voyage begins. On the evening of May 3rd, 1937, the Hindenburg departed from Rhein-Main Airport near Frankfurt at 7:07 in the evening, local time. The departure was routine in every way. The weather over Germany was clear and mild. A light wind blew from the west, perfect for an Atlantic crossing. The ground crew released the mooring lines, and the great ship rose into the evening sky, turning slowly to align with its course westward. Captain Max Pruss stood in the control gondola, giving quiet orders, checking instruments, ensuring that everything was proceeding according to plan. The passengers aboard this flight were a typical mix for a Hindenburg voyage. There were German businessmen returning to America after visiting the homeland. There were American tourists who had been traveling in Europe and were now heading home. There was one passenger making his first ever airplane flight, and a 10-year-old boy named Werner Franz, who was the cabin boy's son, traveling to America to visit relatives. The youngest passenger was Irene Dana, an 8-year-old girl, traveling with her mother and 2 brothers. The oldest was Leonhard Adelt, a 62-year-old German journalist traveling with his wife. Among the passengers were also Ernst Huckel, a professional musician, and Joseph Spey, a vaudeville performer who had brought his dog aboard, a German shepherd kept in a cargo space that Speer visited regularly during the voyage to check on the animal. The crew numbered 61 men for this particular voyage. Besides Captain Pruss, there was First Officer Ernst Lehmann, one of the most experienced Zeppelin commanders in the world, flying as an observer. Lehmann had been involved with Zeppelin operations since before World War I and had commanded multiple successful flights. Also aboard were 3 watch officers, 10 radio operators, riggers, engineers, mechanics, stewards, and cooks. Every man knew his job and had performed it many times before. There was easy camaraderie among the crew, the comfortable familiarity of men who had worked together for months or years. The flight across Europe proceeded without incident. The Hindenburg passed over the Rhine River, crossed France, and approached the English Channel. By morning on May 4th, the ship was over the Atlantic Ocean, heading west at a steady 70 miles per hour. The weather remained favorable. The engines ran smoothly. The passengers spent the day in the lounges, enjoying meals, playing cards, watching the ocean pass below. In the evening, they retired to their cabins, and the ship continued through the night, pushing westward through the darkness. May 5th brought more of the same: clear skies, good visibility, steady winds. The Hindenburg crossed the Atlantic at its standard altitude of about 600 feet, when over water, low enough that passengers could easily see ships passing below and could estimate the airship's speed by watching the waves roll beneath them. Radio messages were exchanged with stations in Greenland and Newfoundland, giving position reports, receiving weather updates. Everything was routine. The passenger list included some first-time flyers who marveled at every aspect of the journey, and some experienced travelers for whom this was just another Atlantic crossing, pleasant but familiar. By the morning of May 6th, the Hindenburg was approaching the coast of America. Passengers crowded to the windows as the shoreline appeared ahead, rising from the sea. The ship passed over Cape Cod, then followed the coast south toward New York. At around 4 in the afternoon, the Hindenburg appeared over New York City, flying low over Manhattan, giving the passengers spectacular views of the skyline and giving New Yorkers equally spectacular views of the great airship overhead. Thousands of people stopped on the streets to look up and point. Office workers crowded to windows. It was a sight that never failed to impress. This enormous silver giant floating overhead, moving slowly and majestically across the sky. From New York, it was approximately 60 miles south to Lakehurst Naval Air Station in New Jersey, the Hindenburg's American terminus. The flight should have taken less than an hour. But as the airship approached Lakehurst, the crew received word from the ground that a weather system had moved in over the landing field. Thunderstorms were in the area, with lightning and strong winds. Landing in such conditions would be dangerous. The airship would have to wait for the weather to clear. Captain Pruss ordered the ship to circle. For the next several hours, the Hindenburg flew back and forth along the New Jersey coast, staying away from the storm cells, waiting for word from the ground that conditions had improved enough for a safe landing. The passengers, who had been excited about arriving, now found themselves in a state of suspended anticipation. Dinner was served in the dining room. Some passengers retired to their cabins. Others remained in the lounge, watching through the windows as rain squalls passed below and lightning flickered in the clouds. By 6:30 in the evening, the weather at Lakehurst had improved. The worst of the storms had passed through. The winds had diminished. The ceiling had lifted. Commander Charles Rosendahl, the commanding officer of the Naval Air Station, and an experienced lighter-than-air officer himself, radioed the Hindenburg that conditions were now acceptable for landing. Captain Pruss acknowledged and turned the ship toward Lakehurst. The landing crew on the ground, more than 200 sailors and civilian workers, took their positions around the landing area, ready to grab the ropes that would be dropped from the approaching airship. The Hindenburg approached the field from the southwest, flying into a light headwind. Pruss reduced power to the engines, allowing the ship to slow. At 7:09, the airship passed over the landing circle, a large area of sandy soil near the mooring mast. The ship was flying at about 200 feet altitude, slightly higher than normal, because there was still a moderate wind that made the landing crew's job more difficult if the ship was too close to the ground. Pruss ordered the ship to turn, executing a tight S-turn to position the nose of the airship directly over the mooring mast. At 7:21, with the ship positioned correctly, the crew in the bow dropped the mooring ropes. These thick manila ropes, hundreds of feet long, fell from the front of the ship and were immediately seized by the ground crew below. Other ropes were dropped from points along the sides of the hull. The men on the ground began pulling, applying tension, helping to position the ship and control its movement in the wind. Inside the control gondola, the officers were focused on their instruments and on watching the ground below. Everything was proceeding normally. The landing was slightly delayed because of the weather. But otherwise, this was a routine arrival. In the passenger areas, people were gathering their belongings, preparing to disembark. Cameras were out, as passengers wanted photographs of the landing. Some stood at the windows, watching the ground grow closer, seeing the crowd of spectators gathered at the edge of the field, seeing the newsreel cameramen with their equipment, seeing the cars parked near the fence. The public was always interested in the Hindenburg's arrivals. It was a spectacle, a chance to see this marvel of modern aviation up close. On the ground, among the spectators, was a radio reporter named Herbert Morrison, sent by a Chicago radio station to record an audio description of the landing. Morrison stood near the mooring mast with his engineer, who operated a disc recording machine. Morrison had covered Hindenburg landings before. He knew what to expect. He began his description, speaking into the microphone, describing the scene, the ship approaching, the ground crew preparing. His voice was enthusiastic, filled with the excitement of the moment. At 7:25, everything was in order. The bow ropes were secured. The stern ropes were being brought down. The ship was settling lower, the nose already beginning to tilt downward as it was pulled toward the mast. Captain Pruss was satisfied. Another successful crossing was nearly complete. In another 15 minutes, The passengers would be safely on the ground, and the crew could begin the process of securing the ship for the night. No one knew that they had less than 1 minute left. 7:25. The fire begins. At exactly 7:25 in the evening, someone on the ground noticed something strange. A flutter of fabric near the stern of the airship, near the top of the hull, close to where the vertical tail fins rose. One of the gas cells had ruptured, releasing hydrogen. Then, instantly, impossibly, there was fire. A small tongue of flame appeared on the outer covering of the ship, near the top of the vertical fin, just forward of the upper tail fin. It spread with stunning speed, racing across the fabric covering, consuming the treated cotton in seconds. The flame was orange and bright, clearly visible even in the early evening light. Herbert Morrison saw it. His voice, which had been cheerful and routine, suddenly changed. "It's burst into flames," he cried into the microphone. His engineer continued recording, capturing Morrison's words, capturing the roar of the fire, capturing one of history's most dramatic moments in real time. "Get out of the way, please," Morrison shouted, his voice rising in pitch and intensity. "It's burning, bursting into flames, and is falling. Oh, this is one of the worst catastrophes in the world." In the control gondola, the officers saw warning lights flash. They felt the ship shudder. Captain Pruss looked back and saw through the windows of the gondola that the stern of the ship was engulfed in flame. Fire was racing forward along the top of the hull, consuming the fabric covering, exposing the aluminum framework beneath. The ship was falling. The stern dropped first, as the gas cells there were consumed by fire and lost their lift. Pruss shouted orders, but there was nothing to be done. The Hindenburg was doomed. The only question was whether anyone would survive. The passengers in the lounge and dining rooms were thrown to the floor as the ship tilted. Some saw the flames outside the windows, others saw only confusion and chaos. Stewards and crew members shouted for everyone to stay calm, to move toward the exits. But there was no time for an orderly evacuation. The ship was falling out of the sky, the stern dropping, the nose rising at an increasingly steep angle. People tumbled backward, grabbing for handholds, screaming in fear and confusion. On the ground, the landing crew dropped the ropes and ran. The ship was falling directly toward them, and it was on fire, a massive inferno growing larger every second. 200 men scattered in all directions, desperate to get clear before the burning wreckage landed on them. Spectators at the edge of the field stood frozen for a moment, unable to process what they were seeing, unable to believe that this majestic ship could be destroyed so quickly. Then, they too began to run. The fire spread with terrifying speed. Hydrogen, released from the ruptured gas cells, mixed with oxygen and burned with intense heat. The temperature inside the hull reached thousands of degrees. The aluminum framework, which had given the ship its rigid shape, began to melt and collapse. The fabric covering was consumed in seconds, disappearing like tissue paper in a furnace. What had been a graceful, floating palace was now a falling, burning wreck. From the moment the first flame appeared to the moment the ship hit the ground was 32 seconds, half a minute. In that time, the largest aircraft ever built was destroyed. Inside the ship, those 32 seconds were an eternity of terror. Margaret Mather, a passenger traveling with her husband, would later describe how they were standing near the windows in the lounge when the ship suddenly tilted. They fell backward, tumbling against chairs and tables. She heard screams, saw fire through the windows, felt the ship dropping. Her husband grabbed her hand and pulled her toward a window. They jumped together, falling through the air, hitting the ground hard but surviving. Others were not so fortunate. Some passengers were trapped in their cabins, with no time to reach the exits before fire blocked the corridors. The flames moved faster than anyone could run, racing through the interior spaces, consuming everything. Those who were trapped had mere seconds to react, to make decisions about whether to try to escape through flames or to stay where they were and hope. For many, there was no time even for that choice. The fire reached them before they could move. Others made it to the windows and jumped, leaping from a height of 50 or 100 feet, choosing to risk the fall rather than burn. Some jumped too early, when the ship was still too high, and were killed by the impact with the ground. Others waited, hanging from window frames or sitting on the sills, timing their jumps to occur when the falling ship was close enough to the ground that they might survive. It required extraordinary courage and split-second judgment. Jump too soon, and you die from the fall. Wait too long, and the flames reach you, or the ship crushes you when it hits the ground. Several passengers and crew members made this calculation correctly and survived with injuries. Others miscalculated and died. Crew members tried desperately to help passengers, tried to maintain order, but the situation was beyond anyone's control. The ship was disintegrating around them, the framework twisting and collapsing, sections of the hull separating, fire everywhere. Some crew members stayed at their posts until the very end, following their training, attempting to control the disaster even as it became clear that the ship was lost. Radio operator Willie Speck sent a final distress message even as flames entered the radio room. He survived, but barely, escaping from the wreckage with severe burns. Werner Franz, the 14-year-old cabin boy, was near the bow of the ship when the fire began. He saw the flames racing forward and ran toward the nearest window. As he ran, a water ballast tank above him burst, drenching him with water. That water saved his life. When he jumped from the window, his wet clothes protected him from the fire long enough to hit the ground and roll clear. He survived with minor injuries. Joseph Speer, the acrobat, was near the windows on the starboard side. When the ship began to fall, he grabbed the window frame and hung outside, waiting for the ship to get closer to the ground. When it was perhaps 30 feet up, he let go and dropped, landing hard but surviving. He would later describe how he heard his dog barking in its crate somewhere in the burning wreckage, but there was nothing he could do to save it. 8-year-old Irene Dana was with her mother and brothers when the fire began. They were in the dining room. As the ship tilted, they fell together, tumbling toward the stern. Irene's mother managed to push her children toward a window. One of her brothers died in the fire. Her mother died. Irene and her surviving brother were rescued from the burning wreckage by sailors from the ground crew who rushed in despite the flames. Both children were badly burned. Captain Pruss stayed at his post in the control gondola until the very end. He shouted orders, trying to maintain control, trying to bring the ship down as gently as possible, even as it was engulfed in flames. When the gondola hit the ground, the impact threw him clear. He staggered away from the wreck, his clothes on fire, his face burned. He survived, though he would carry the scars for the rest of his life. Herbert Morrison continued to broadcast, his voice breaking with emotion. "It's a terrific crash. Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his words tumbling out rapidly. "The smoke and the flames now, and the frame is crashing to the ground. Oh, the humanity." His voice cracked on those last words, and he began to sob openly, unable to continue. The recording captured it all: the roar of the fire, the screams, Morrison's anguished voice, the crash of the collapsing structure hitting the ground. It would become one of the most famous recordings in broadcast history, played over and over in the days and years that followed, ensuring that the Hindenburg disaster would never be forgotten. On the ground, once the initial shock passed, rescuers rushed toward the burning wreckage. Sailors from the Naval Air Station, civilians from the landing crew, medics, firemen with extinguishers, all converged on the crash site. The heat was intense. The metal framework was still burning. Hydrogen flames, nearly invisible in daylight, flickered across the twisted wreckage. But there were people in there, people who might still be alive, and the rescuers went in despite the danger. They found survivors stumbling from the wreck, clothes burned away, skin blackened, in shock but alive. They found bodies, some recognizable, some burned beyond identification. They searched through the twisted metal and burning fabric, calling out, listening for responses, pulling out anyone they found. The rescue efforts continued for hours, long after the last flames had been extinguished. long after it became clear that anyone who had survived the initial crash had already been found. When the accounting was finally complete, 36 people had died. 13 passengers, 22 crew members, and one member of the ground crew, Alan Hageman, who was killed when the falling ship struck him as he tried to help with the landing. 62 people survived, many of them injured, some terribly burned, but alive. The survival rate was actually remarkable, given the nature of the disaster. The fact that almost 2/3 of those aboard lived was due to several factors working in their favor. First, the ship was close to the ground when the fire began, only about 200 feet in altitude, which gave people a chance to escape that they would not have had at higher altitude. Second, the rescue efforts were immediate and heroic. Sailors and civilians rushed into the burning wreckage within seconds, pulling out survivors, beating out flames on clothing, carrying injured people to safety. Third, the ship fell almost straight down rather than careening across the field, which meant that the impact, while devastating, was somewhat contained. And fourth, there was an element of pure chance. Some people survived because they happened to be in the right place at the right moment, near a window or an exit, away from the worst of the flames. Others died, despite being strong and healthy and doing everything right, simply because the fire reached them first. Among those who died was Ernst Lehmann, the experienced Zeppelin commander who had been flying as an observer. Lehmann made it out of the wreckage but was severely burned over much of his body. He was taken to the hospital, where he lingered for several hours before succumbing to his injuries. His last words, according to witnesses, were an attempt to explain what had happened, but he was too badly injured to make himself understood. His death was mourned throughout Germany, for he had been one of the pioneers of airship flight, a hero of the early aviation age. Also, among the dead were 7 members of the ground crew who had been directly beneath the ship when it fell. These men, mostly sailors from the Naval Air Station, had been doing their jobs, helping to land the airship, when the disaster struck. They had no time to escape, no warning that the ship above them was about to become a falling inferno. Their deaths were particularly tragic because they were not even passengers or crew of the Hindenburg but innocent bystanders doing their duty. The survivors told harrowing stories. Leonhard Adelt, the journalist, described jumping from a window with his wife Gertrude. They landed hard, but survived with minor injuries. Adelt later wrote an account of the disaster for a German newspaper, describing the terror of being inside the burning ship, the desperate scramble to escape, the surreal experience of one moment being a passenger on a magnificent airship, and the next being a survivor of a catastrophe. His wife, in her own account, described the kindness of the rescuers, how strangers rushed to help, how doctors and nurses worked through the night, treating the injured, how the American public responded with sympathy and support. But 36 dead was more than enough. The Hindenburg, the pride of the German Zeppelin company, the symbol of the airship age, the ship that had completed dozens of successful voyages without a single passenger injury, was gone, destroyed in less than a minute. And with it, died the dream of passenger airship travel. The aftermath. The burning wreckage of the Hindenburg smoldered through the night. Fire crews from the Naval Air Station and from nearby towns kept watch, preventing the flames from spreading, extinguishing hot spots as they flared up. By morning, what remained of the great airship was a blackened tangle of twisted metal and ashes spread across the landing field. The aluminum framework, which had given the ship its shape and strength, had melted and collapsed into an almost unrecognizable mass. The fabric covering was completely gone, burned away in the first seconds of the fire. What had been 800 feet of graceful, silvery magnificence was now a pile of scrap. The bodies of the victims were taken to a temporary morgue set up in one of the base hangars. Identification was difficult. Some victims had burns so severe that they could only be identified by personal effects or dental records. The crew members could sometimes be identified by their uniforms or by the locations where their bodies were found, which indicated what their stations had been. The passengers were harder. Families were notified as identifications were made, and the difficult process of arranging for funerals and repatriation began. The survivors were taken to the base hospital and to nearby civilian hospitals. Their injuries ranged from minor burns and bruises to devastating burns covering much of their bodies. Captain Pruss was hospitalized with serious burns to his face, hands, and body. He would undergo multiple surgeries and skin grafts over the following months. Some survivors, like cabin boy Werner Franz, were released after a day or two with relatively minor injuries. Others would spend weeks or months in the hospital. A few would never fully recover from their physical injuries, and all would carry psychological scars from the experience. News of the disaster spread rapidly. The Associated Press wire service transmitted the first bulletin within minutes of the crash. Radio stations interrupted their regular programming to broadcast the news. Newspapers across America and around the world rushed to print special editions with huge headlines announcing the catastrophe. By the next morning, the Hindenburg disaster was the top story everywhere. Photographs of the burning airship, taken by the newsreel cameramen and press photographers who had been at Lakehurst to cover the routine landing, were published on front pages worldwide. The images were shocking, dramatic, and unforgettable. The massive ship tilting nose up, the stern engulfed in flame, people running from the wreckage. These images came to define the disaster in the public imagination. Herbert Morrison's radio recording was broadcast the next day on networks across America. Listeners heard his voice describing the landing. Then the sudden change in tone, the shock and horror as the fire erupted, his famous cry, "Oh, the humanity!" and his inability to continue as emotion overwhelmed him. The recording had an enormous impact. It brought the disaster into American living rooms in a way that newspaper accounts could not. People heard the terror in Morrison's voice, heard the roar of the flames, heard the reality of the catastrophe, and they were moved. The recording made the Hindenburg disaster personal in a way few news events had been before. The German government reacted with shock and grief. The Hindenburg had been a source of national pride, a symbol of German technological achievement. Its loss was both a human tragedy and a propaganda disaster. Nazi officials, including Adolf Hitler himself, sent messages of condolence to the families of the victims. The German ambassador to the United States issued a statement expressing sorrow and promising full cooperation with any investigation. Plans were immediately made to send German investigators to America to work with U.S. authorities in determining what had caused the disaster. Dr. Hugo Eckener, the director of the Zeppelin Company, who had overseen the Hindenburg's design and construction, was in Austria when he heard the news. He was devastated. His life's work, the realization of Count von Zeppelin's dream, had been destroyed. Eckener traveled to America to participate in the investigation and to view the wreckage. When he saw the twisted remains of his creation, he wept. In public statements, he expressed his profound sorrow and his determination to discover what had gone wrong. But privately, he knew that the disaster, regardless of its cause, had doomed the airship industry. The public would never trust hydrogen-filled airships again. In the days following the disaster, as the shock began to wear off and the immediate crisis passed, attention turned to the question of cause. What had destroyed the Hindenburg? How could a ship that had completed dozens of successful flights be destroyed so quickly and completely? Was it an accident, or was it sabotage? The search for answers began, even as the wreckage still smoldered. Theories emerged almost immediately. Some people insisted it must have been sabotage. The Hindenburg was a symbol of Nazi Germany, and there were many people in America and elsewhere who hated the Nazi regime and might have wanted to strike a blow against it. Anti-Nazi activists, it was suggested, might have planted a bomb or an incendiary device aboard the ship. The fact that the fire began near the stern, away from the areas where passengers and most crew were located, seemed to some to support this theory. A saboteur could have hidden a time bomb in that area, knowing it would detonate after the ship had landed and the crew was focused on mooring procedures. Others pointed to the weather. There had been thunderstorms in the area earlier in the day, and the air was charged with electricity. Perhaps lightning had struck the ship, igniting the hydrogen. But there had been no visible lightning strike at the moment the fire began, and the crew in the control gondola who would have felt and heard a lightning strike, reported no such event. Still, the static electricity theory gained traction. Perhaps the ship had built up a static electrical charge during the storm, and when the wet mooring ropes, which were grounded, touched the ship's framework, a spark had been generated, igniting leaking hydrogen. Some investigators focused on the fabric covering. The cotton fabric was treated with a cellulose compound, mixed with aluminum powder, to make it weatherproof and to reduce weight. Some researchers would later suggest that this coating itself was flammable, almost like rocket fuel, and that a spark could have ignited the fabric, which then burned rapidly and generated enough heat to ignite the hydrogen. This theory was controversial and would be debated for decades. There were also human error theories. Had a gas cell been accidentally vented at the wrong time? Had a broken wire punctured a cell, releasing hydrogen into the space between the cells and the outer cover? Had a crew member made some mistake during the landing procedure that led to the disaster? These possibilities were investigated thoroughly, with every crew member who survived being questioned extensively about their actions and observations in the minutes before the fire. The investigation would take months. But one thing was clear from the beginning. Whatever the cause, the Hindenburg disaster had destroyed public confidence in airship travel. No one would want to fly on a hydrogen-filled airship after seeing the Hindenburg burn. The age of the passenger airship, which had seemed so promising just days before, was over. Investigation and theories. 2 formal investigations into the Hindenburg disaster were conducted. The first was by the United States Department of Commerce, which had jurisdiction over civil aviation in America. The second was by the German government, specifically the Luftwaffe, which now controlled German aviation matters. Both investigations began within days of the disaster and continued for months, interviewing survivors, examining the wreckage, analyzing every piece of evidence that could be found. The American investigation was led by a team of experts including engineers, aviation specialists, and naval officers with experience in lighter-than aircraft. They began by carefully documenting the wreckage, photographing every piece of the twisted framework, cataloguing the debris, looking for any clues that might indicate where the fire had started and why. They interviewed the surviving passengers and crew members, taking detailed statements about what each person had seen, heard, and experienced. They consulted with metallurgists about the condition of the aluminum framework, with chemists about the properties of hydrogen and the fabric coating, with electrical engineers about the possibility of static discharge. The German investigation team arrived in America within days of the disaster. They brought their own expertise and their own perspective. Led by Colonel Fritz Erdmann of the Luftwaffe, the team included Zeppelin Company engineers, fire investigators, and metallurgical experts. They were particularly concerned about the possibility of sabotage. An attack on the Hindenburg would be an attack on Germany itself, a propaganda victory for enemies of the Nazi regime. The German investigators interviewed the crew members extensively, often conducting multiple interviews with the same person, looking for any inconsistencies that might indicate someone had seen something suspicious and was hiding it. The interviews revealed that the crew had noticed nothing unusual before the fire began. The ship had been handling normally during the landing approach. All instruments showed normal readings. The gas cell pressure gauges indicated no problems. The ballast and gas valve systems were functioning properly. The engines were running smoothly. There had been no electrical problems, no equipment failures, no warning signs of any kind. If something had gone wrong mechanically, it had happened in the final seconds before the fire appeared, too quickly for anyone to notice. Witnesses on the ground provided additional information. Several people reported seeing a flutter in the fabric covering near the stern just before the fire began. This flutter appeared to be caused by internal pressure, as if something inside the ship had burst or vented suddenly. Immediately after the flutter, the first flames appeared in the same area. This sequence of events, flutter followed immediately by fire, suggested that a gas cell had ruptured, releasing hydrogen into the space between the cells and the outer covering, and that this hydrogen had then been ignited by something. But what could have caused a gas cell to rupture? The cells were designed to be robust, capable of withstanding changes in pressure and temperature. The ship had flown through worse weather conditions than those experienced on May 6th without any problems. The investigators examined the wreckage carefully, looking for evidence of structural failure, broken wires, sharp edges, anything that might have punctured a cell. They found some possibilities, including damaged bracing wires in the stern area, but could not determine whether these wires had broken before the fire or as a result of the fire and the subsequent crash. One theory that gained significant attention was the static electricity hypothesis. Several witnesses reported seeing a flutter in the outer covering of the ship near the stern just before the fire began. This flutter suggested that a gas cell in that area had burst or been punctured, releasing hydrogen into the space between the cells and the outer covering. If hydrogen had accumulated in that space, and if the ship then became grounded through the wet mooring ropes touching the frame, a spark from static discharge could have ignited the gas. The weather conditions that day had been perfect for building up a static charge. The ship had flown through storms and rain. The air was humid. When the metal framework, carrying a static charge, suddenly became grounded, electricity could have arced, creating a spark. This theory was supported by several pieces of evidence. The fire had indeed begun at the stern, near the vertical tail fin, where witnesses saw the flutter. The outer covering in that area showed evidence of a tear or break. No evidence of an explosive device was found in the wreckage, which seemed to argue against sabotage. The weather and atmospheric conditions were conducive to static electricity buildup. The theory fit the known facts, but not everyone was convinced. Some investigators pointed out that if a gas cell had burst, the crew should have known about it immediately. The ship had gas pressure gauges that monitored each cell. A sudden loss of pressure would have been obvious. Yet none of the surviving crew members from the control gondola reported any warning signs before the fire began. The instruments had all appeared normal. If a cell had ruptured, it must have happened just seconds before the fire started, too quickly for the crew to notice. The sabotage theory refused to die. In the aftermath of the disaster, several people came forward claiming to have information about plots to destroy the Hindenburg. One man claimed that an anti-Nazi activist group had placed a bomb aboard the ship. Another said that a disgruntled crew member had started the fire deliberately, but none of these claims could be substantiated. The FBI investigated each allegation and found no credible evidence. Most of the claims appeared to be from people seeking attention or who had personal agendas against the Nazi regime. One crew member who came under suspicion was a rigger named Eric Spale, who died in the disaster. Spale had been stationed near the stern during the landing. His body was found in that area of the wreckage. Some investigators theorized that Spale might have been an anti-Nazi activist who set a time bomb and then was trapped by his own device when it detonated. But there was no evidence to support this theory beyond Spale's presence in the area where the fire started, which was explained by his workstation assignment. His girlfriend, who survived him, insisted that Spale had no political affiliations and no reason to sabotage the ship. Most historians now consider the Spale theory to be unfounded. Another controversial theory involved the fabric coating. In the 1990s, almost 60 years after the disaster, retired NASA engineer Addison Bain proposed that the fire had been caused not by the hydrogen, but by the highly flammable coating on the fabric covering. Bain's analysis suggested that the cellulose and aluminum powder mixture used to seal and protect the fabric was similar in composition to solid rocket fuel. A spark, perhaps from static electricity, could have ignited this coating, which then burned rapidly, creating the spectacular flames seen in photographs and newsreels. The hydrogen, Bain argued, burned with an almost invisible flame and would not have produced the orange and red flames visible in the disaster. Those flames came from the burning fabric and coating. Bain's theory generated significant controversy. Some experts agreed that the fabric coating was indeed flammable and could have contributed to the rapid spread of the fire. Others argued that while the coating might burn, the primary fuel for the fire was undoubtedly the 7 million cubic feet of hydrogen gas. The debate continues to this day among historians and engineers, though most experts believe the hydrogen was the main factor in the speed and intensity of the fire, even if the fabric coating contributed to the visible flames. What both official investigations agreed on was that there was no evidence of sabotage. No bomb residue was found. No timing device was discovered. No credible witness reported seeing anyone place a suspicious object aboard the ship. The fire appeared to be an accident, most likely caused by a combination of factors, including a gas cell failure, static electricity, and unfavorable atmospheric conditions. The final reports from both the American and German investigations reached similar conclusions, though they phrased them slightly differently. The fire was caused by the ignition of hydrogen released from a ruptured gas cell, ignited by an electrostatic discharge. But even with this conclusion, questions remained. Why had that particular gas cell failed? Was there a structural defect in the ship? Had the unusual maneuvering during the landing approach, including the tight S-turn, put unusual stress on the framework? Had there been a broken wire that punctured a cell? These questions could not be answered definitively, because the evidence had been destroyed in the fire. The truth of what happened in those final seconds before the fire began would never be known with certainty. What was known with certainty was that the disaster had ended the age of the passenger airship. The sister ship to the Hindenburg, the Graf Zeppelin II, which was nearing completion when the disaster occurred, would make only a handful of test flights before being scrapped at the beginning of World War II. No passenger airship would ever fly again. The future belonged to airplanes, which were becoming larger, faster, and more capable with each passing year. Within a few years, aircraft like the Boeing Stratoliner and the Douglas DC-4 would be crossing oceans, carrying passengers in pressurized, heated cabins at altitudes where airships could never fly. The Hindenburg disaster had been the final, definitive end to a dream that had begun with Count von Zeppelin half a century earlier. The end of an era. In the days and weeks following the disaster, the Zeppelin company struggled to come to terms with the loss. The Hindenburg had been their flagship, their most advanced creation, the proof that passenger airship travel was viable and safe. Its destruction called into question everything they had built. Dr. Hugo Eckener, the company's director, made public statements expressing confidence that airship travel would continue, that the disaster was a tragic accident, but not a reason to abandon decades of experience and success. Privately, he was less optimistic. He knew that public perception had turned against airships, and that perception was more powerful than any technical arguments he could make. The Graf Zeppelin, the older airship that had completed more than 1 million miles of safe flying, was grounded immediately after the Hindenburg disaster. The company announced that the ship would not fly again until a complete safety review had been conducted. But the Graf Zeppelin never flew with passengers again. It made a few final flights in 1937 and 38, mostly propaganda missions for the Nazi regime, and then was retired. In 1940, as World War II engulfed Europe, the ship was broken up. Its aluminum framework melted down to build military aircraft. The Graf Zeppelin II, the Hindenburg sister ship, was nearly complete when the disaster occurred. The Zeppelin company briefly considered finishing the ship and putting it into service, perhaps filling it with helium instead of hydrogen if the United States government could be convinced to lift its export ban. But this hope proved futile. The American government, already suspicious of Nazi Germany, had no intention of providing helium for German airships that might be used for military purposes. And without helium, no one wanted to fly on a hydrogen-filled airship. The Graf Zeppelin II was completed and conducted a few test flights, but it never carried paying passengers. In 1940, it too was scrapped. Other airship programs around the world also came to an end. The British had already abandoned airship development after the R-101 disaster in 1930. The Americans continued to build airships for the Navy, but these were non-rigid blimps used for coastal patrol and submarine detection, not the large, rigid airships designed for passenger service. France, which had experimented with airships, gave up the program. The Soviet Union, which had built several experimental airships, abandoned them. By 1940, rigid airship construction had ceased everywhere in the world. The Hindenburg disaster had not been the only cause of this abandonment, but it was the most visible and dramatic factor. The disaster also accelerated the development of heavier-than-air passenger aircraft. Airlines and aircraft manufacturers had been working on larger, more capable airplanes throughout the 1930s, but progress had been gradual. The Hindenburg disaster demonstrated that the public wanted safer, more reliable air transportation, and airplanes offered that. The late 1930s and early 1940s saw rapid advances in aircraft design: pressurized cabins, more powerful engines, longer range, better navigation systems. All of these improvements came quickly as the aviation industry recognized that the future belonged to them, not to airships. By 1939, Pan American Airways was operating flying boats, large seaplanes that could cross the Atlantic, carrying passengers in luxury similar to what the Hindenburg had offered. The Boeing 314 Clipper could carry 74 passengers from New York to Southampton, England, with stops in Newfoundland and Ireland. The trip took longer than an airship voyage, about 29 hours of flying time, but the aircraft was powered by gasoline, not hydrogen, and the public perceived it as safer. Within a few years, land-based aircraft like the Douglas DC-4 and the Lockheed Constellation would make the flying boats obsolete, just as airplanes had made airships obsolete. The Hindenburg disaster had other lasting effects on aviation safety. The disaster highlighted the importance of non-flammable lifting gases. While airships would never return to passenger service, military and commercial blimps continued to use helium, which was safe but less efficient than hydrogen. The disaster also led to more stringent regulations regarding fire safety in aircraft. Materials used in cabin construction, fabrics, wiring, all came under greater scrutiny. The idea that an aircraft could be destroyed in less than a minute by fire was unacceptable, and the industry worked to ensure that such a rapid conflagration could never happen again in any type of aircraft. The disaster also changed how news was reported. Herbert Morrison's emotional radio broadcast became a template for disaster coverage. The raw, unscripted reaction, the human emotion, the sense of being present at a tragic event, became something audiences expected and news organizations tried to provide. The Morrison recording was played repeatedly in the days after the disaster, and it has been played countless times since, in documentaries, in classrooms, in museums. It remains one of the most powerful pieces of audio journalism ever recorded. For the survivors of the disaster, life went on, but they were forever marked by the experience. Captain Pruss recovered from his burns and returned to Germany, where he worked for the Zeppelin Company until the start of World War II. He never commanded another airship. Werner Franz, the cabin boy who survived by being drenched with water from a burst ballast tank, lived a long life and spoke publicly about his experience on several occasions. He died in 2014 at the age of 92, the last surviving crew member of the Hindenburg. Other survivors rarely spoke about the disaster, preferring to put the trauma behind them and move on with their lives. The families of those who died sought compensation, and legal proceedings continued for years. The Zeppelin Company and the German government eventually paid settlements to the families, though no amount of money could compensate for the loss of loved ones. Some families found solace in the fact that their relatives had been part of history, part of one of the most significant events in aviation history, though this was surely small comfort. The wreckage of the Hindenburg was eventually cleared away from the Lakehurst landing field. Some pieces were saved for the investigations. A few items were recovered and returned to families of the victims. Small fragments of the aluminum framework were taken as souvenirs by people who visited the site, and these artifacts occasionally appear in museums or private collections. Most of the wreckage was simply scrapped, the metal sold as scrap aluminum. By 1938, nothing remained at Lakehurst to indicate that the greatest disaster in airship history had occurred there, except for memories and photographs. The Naval Air Station at Lakehurst continued to operate for many years, serving as a base for Navy blimps during World War II and beyond. The giant mooring mast, where the Hindenburg had been heading when it caught fire, stood for many years as a silent monument to the disaster. Eventually, it too was dismantled. Today, Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst, as it is now called, still exists, but there is little to indicate its connection to the Hindenburg, except for a small memorial and a museum. Legacy and remembrance. The Hindenburg disaster has maintained its place in public consciousness in a way few historical events have. Part of this is due to the dramatic nature of the disaster itself. The sight of the enormous airship exploding in flames, the Morrison recording with its anguished, "Oh, the humanity," the photographs and newsreel footage, all combined to create an indelible impression. But the disaster also resonated because it represented the end of something, the final failure of a technology that had promised so much. In popular culture, the Hindenburg has appeared repeatedly. The disaster has been depicted in numerous documentaries, films, and television programs. A 1975 film titled The Hindenburg, starring George C. Scott, dramatized the disaster and promoted the sabotage theory, though historians generally dismiss the film's conclusions. The Led Zeppelin album cover that shows the burning Hindenburg became one of the most iconic images in rock music. References to the disaster appear in books, songs, and even cartoons. The Hindenburg has become a metaphor for sudden, catastrophic failure, a cautionary tale about hubris and the dangers of technology. The disaster also influenced aviation regulations and safety practices worldwide. The lessons learned from the investigation led to improvements in fire safety, in the use of non-flammable materials, in emergency evacuation procedures. While these lessons were applied primarily to airplanes rather than airships, since airships never returned to passenger service, the principles established after the Hindenburg disaster continue to influence aviation safety to this day. Several museums commemorate the Hindenburg and the era of airship travel. The Zeppelin Museum in Friedrichshafen, Germany, near where the Hindenburg was built, houses a partial reconstruction of the ship's interior, allowing visitors to see what the passenger accommodations looked like. The Navy Lakehurst Historical Society maintains exhibits about the disaster at the former Naval Air Station. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. has artifacts from the Hindenburg in its collection. These museums ensure that the story of the airship age and its tragic end continues to be told to new generations. Efforts have been made over the years to revive airship travel, though not with hydrogen. Several companies have built helium-filled blimps and semi-rigid airships for advertising, tourism, and surveillance purposes. In recent years, there has been renewed interest in developing large cargo airships that could transport heavy loads to remote areas without requiring runways or infrastructure. These modern airships use helium and advanced materials, and they are designed with safety as the paramount concern. Whether these efforts will lead to a revival of commercial airship travel remains to be seen, but they represent a continuing fascination with the possibilities that Count von Zeppelin and his successors pursued. The survivors and their descendants have kept the memory of the Hindenburg alive through their own efforts. For many years, there were regular gatherings of survivors, where they would share their memories and support each other. As the survivors aged and passed away, their children and grandchildren took up the task of remembering. Werner Franz, the cabin boy, became a spokesman for the Hindenburg survivors in his later years, giving interviews, attending commemorations, ensuring that the human stories behind the disaster were not forgotten. Historians continue to study the disaster, seeking to understand exactly what happened and why. New analyses of the wreckage, new examinations of the weather conditions, new theories about the ignition source, all continue to be proposed and debated. The truth may never be known with absolute certainty, but the search for understanding continues. Each new generation of historians and engineers looks at the evidence and tries to piece together those final seconds before the fire began. The Hindenburg disaster also serves as a reminder of the dangers inherent in new technologies. The airship pioneers believed they had created a safe, reliable form of transportation. They had decades of experience. They had made hundreds of successful flights. They had every reason to be confident. And yet, in 32 seconds, all of that experience and confidence was rendered meaningless. The disaster teaches humility, the understanding that no matter how much we think we know, there are always unknowns, always risks, always the possibility that something can go catastrophically wrong. At the same time, the disaster should not overshadow the achievements of the airship age. The The Zeppelins flew millions of miles safely. They carried thousands of passengers without injury over many years. They proved that controlled flight in aircraft lighter than air was possible and practical. The technology was not inherently flawed, though hydrogen was clearly an unacceptable risk for passenger service. If helium had been available, if the political situation had been different, the history of airships might have been very different. The Hindenburg disaster was not an inevitability. It was the result of a specific set of circumstances coming together at a specific moment. The story of the Hindenburg is ultimately a human story. It is about the dreams of pioneers like Count von Zeppelin, who imagined a world connected by air travel. It is about the engineers and workers who built these magnificent machines. It is about the passengers who trusted their lives to this new technology. It is about the crew members who died trying to save their ship and their passengers. And it is about the survivors who lived with the memories of that terrible evening for the rest of their lives. These human stories, more than the technical details or the historical significance, are what make the Hindenburg disaster continue to resonate nearly a century later. Reflection and conclusion. Let us return now to that field in Lakehurst, to that evening in May of 1937. The sun is setting. The air is cool and damp after the day's rain. The crowd waits at the edge of the landing area, excited to see the great airship arrive. Children point at the sky. Newsreel cameramen check their equipment. The ground crew stands ready, ropes in hand. And from the southwest comes the Hindenburg, majestic and massive, floating gracefully through the evening air, its engines thrumming softly, its hull gleaming silver in the fading light. No one watching knows what is about to happen. To them, this is just another routine landing, another successful completion of another Atlantic crossing. The ship has done this dozens of times before. There is no reason to expect anything different this time. The passengers inside are gathering their belongings, preparing to disembark. The crew is focused on the landing procedures. Everything is normal. Everything is routine. And then, in an instant, everything changes. Fire appears. The ship tilts. People scream. The wreckage falls. In 32 seconds, the Hindenburg is destroyed, and 36 people are dead. The survivors will carry physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The world will watch the newsreel footage with horror and fascination. The age of the passenger airship will end. Aviation will take a different path, one that leads to the airplanes we fly today. All because of those 32 seconds on a spring evening in New Jersey. What can we take from this story? What lessons does the Hindenburg disaster teach us? Perhaps it teaches humility, the understanding that our technology, no matter how advanced, is never infallible. Perhaps it teaches us to respect the power of nature and the laws of physics, which cannot be circumvented no matter how clever our engineering. Perhaps it teaches us the importance of safety over convenience or profit, the understanding that human lives must be the paramount concern in any undertaking. Perhaps it simply teaches us that history is full of tragedy, moments when the arc of human progress is interrupted by disaster, and that we must acknowledge these moments, learn from them, and continue forward. But beyond the lessons and the historical significance, the Hindenburg disaster is a story about people who dreamed of flying, people who built magnificent machines, people who flew across oceans in comfort and wonder, people who died in fire and horror, people who survived and tried to rebuild their lives. These are the stories that matter, the human experiences that connect us across the decades. When we remember the Hindenburg, we should remember not just the burning wreckage and the dramatic newsreel footage, but the individuals who were there, who lived through those moments, who were affected forever by those 32 seconds. The evening of May 6th, 1937, was a turning point in history. The destruction of the Hindenburg marked the end of one vision of the future and the beginning of another. The dream of giant airships, crossing oceans and continents, carrying passengers in luxury, connecting the world in ways that had never been possible before, died in the flames at Lakehurst. In its place came the airplane age, which has given us faster, more efficient, and ultimately safer air travel. But something was lost as well. The grace and majesty of airship travel, the romance of floating through the sky like a cloud, the experience that passengers on the Hindenburg described as magical. These things are gone and will never return. As you drift towards sleep now, dear listener, let your mind hold the image of the Hindenburg as it was meant to be, not burning and falling, but flying smoothly through calm skies, its passengers looking down at the ocean below, its crew going about their duties with confidence and skill. A floating palace, moving gracefully through the air. Remember it as a symbol of human ingenuity and ambition, a testament to what we can achieve when we dare to dream the impossible. Remember also the fragility of those achievements, the reminder that progress is never guaranteed, that tragedy can strike when we least expect it, that we must always remain humble before the forces we seek to control. The Hindenburg flew for just over 1 year before its destruction. In that year, it carried thousands of people safely across the Atlantic. It proved that airship travel was possible and comfortable. It gave people an experience they would remember for the rest of their lives. And then, in 32 seconds, it was gone. But the memory remains, preserved in photographs and film, in recordings and documents, in the accounts of survivors and witnesses, in museums and histories. The Hindenburg endures not as a ship, but as a story, a piece of our shared past that continues to fascinate and instruct us nearly a century after that terrible evening in May. Close your eyes now. Let the story settle into your thoughts. Feel the quiet of the evening, the gentle stillness that comes with the end of day. Breathe slowly, deeply. Let the tensions in your body release. The Hindenburg is gone, but its story remains, a thread in the fabric of history, connecting past to present, reminding us of dreams and disasters, of ambition and tragedy, of the complexity and fragility of human endeavor. May your rest be peaceful. May your dreams be gentle. And if you enjoyed this journey through history, please take a moment to press like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories continue to be told, helps keep these memories alive for future generations. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you listening from tonight? What other stories from history would you like to hear? Your engagement makes this community what it is, and for that, I thank you. Good night, dear listener. Sleep well. Until the next story calls us back into the past, rest easy in the knowledge that history, with all its wonder and sorrow, continues to teach us, continues to move us, continues to remind us of who we are and where we have come from. Good night.